Moya Podcast brings you Black Wednesdays, a history of black radicalism, hosted by Steve Lebelo.
Okay. Good evening and good evening to the viewers. I think today is an opportunity to actually reflect, and this is important, because this is a subject that, although it has to be at the center of any political discourse or any discourse about the past, it is actually sidelined. It has been actually sidelined, throughout. And I'm talking about the black radical tradition. But the issue here is to really unpack what the black radical tradition is. We are not here talking about, the black radical tradition only as an instrument of mass mobilization. And that is absolutely critical, particularly so for, for 20th century South African history and for the history of resistance to colonialism. Now, inevitably, what we have to do is to focus on the history of resistance in 20th century South Africa and try and understand what the place of black radical thought, would have been, throughout the 20th century. And this is an attempt to do that. Now, in South African history, it is generally accepted, that the Bambata Rebellion of 1906 represented the final phase of the kind of resistance that actually defined the 19th century and earlier periods. That the 1906 Bambata Rebellion actually became a turning point in terms of the ways in which African people engaged with colonial penetration and colonial imposition. What that actually means is that it was the last time that Africans were organized, around what we call today traditional authorities, with Amabuto being mobilized to participate in anti-colonial wars and anti-colonial struggles. It is often, stated that after 1906, after the Bambata Rebellion, new forms of engagement and new forms of organization were needed, to be able to mobilize the masses, if you like, in anti-colonial struggles or in the resistance against colonialism. And only about 4 years after the Bambata Rebellion, the Union of South Africa is established. Now, what that actually does, is to add a further demand, on the ways in which anti-colonial struggles are going to be organized. What it meant is that what is a geographical impression that South Africa was would have to be mobilized, that Africans or stroke natives would have to be mobilized across what it would then become a South Africa, coming out of the 1910 creation, colonial creation of the South African state. And that demand actually meant a need to establish a national organization, that would be able to deal with the issues at the national level. And only 6 years after the Bambata Rebellion, the South African Native National Congress is actually established. Now, let's think about that establishment in relation to the Bambata Rebellion. One of two things would have happened here. And this is where we have to really begin to consider what the Black radical tradition and Black radical thought, would have been at this stage. Now, there's a sense in which the Bambata Rebellion actually acts as a filter. It filters into the 20th century, what was in fact forms of engagement. Yeah, forms of engagement with the colonial regime and with colonial penetration. It acts as a filter in one important sense, and that is whatever defined the Bambata Rebellion in terms of what its ideological thrust and its political character would have been, would then have to be transmitted to the new political organization. And in this case, it would have had to be the ANC. Now, I do know that quite a good number of historians have actually grappled, with this particular issue here. What aspects of 19th century resistance are being transmitted into the early 20th century? And what aspects of those, are being internalized and actually embraced by the SANC, the South African Native National Congress? Now, there are two ways in which African societies responded, to colonial penetration and imposition, particularly in the 19th century. We should not actually have the time to go through a lot of them, but I think the 1856-1857 historical moment is particularly informative and quite instructive, because part of what you have here is Xhosa society divided into two camps. On the one hand, you have the one camp that wants to, embrace Nongqawuze's prophecy. And on the other, you have a camp that says no. And just in terms of ideological and political paradigms, these two can actually be divided into those that wanted to cooperate, with the colonists, and those that were against, colonial penetration from the very beginning. From time to time, we tend to characterize the latter as those that represent the refusal to be incorporated into a colonial social and political order. And they will go to extents, to try and live outside of it. Now, part of what we are actually, trying to grapple with at this stage is to try and formulate a kind of a discourse that is going to represent this latter group that refuses as the basis for what would then become, the Black radical paradigm and Black radical thought in the 20th century. We do recognize that the Bambata Rebellion, acting as a filter, does allow for the transmission of this particular set of responses to colonial penetration to actually go through and begin to define, 20th century responses, to colonial penetration. But, be that as it may, it would appear that for most of the 20th century, this particular strand actually plays, a marginal role in defining, Black struggles, throughout the 20th century. But we are going to have to demonstrate that at different times, this paradigm does actually, burst forth and begin to define, the nature of antagonisms in the South African situation. Now, for starters, we are going to have to look at 1912 and really assess what 1912 actually means. To what extent is 1912 defined by the refusal? And to what extent is 1912 yet another instantiation of cooperation with, colonial penetration and colonial imposition? And this is important. It is important for a number of reasons. But the most important reason here, and we have to state this from the onset, that throughout the 20th century, what actually characterizes resistance to colonial imposition and colonial penetration is in fact the ability to mobilize the masses. And when the masses are actually mobilized, that is when the black radical tradition and black radical thought actually play themselves out. But this is problematic just looking at the South African historiography, because when one looks at the South African historiography, there is a determination to represent 20th century struggles where they were mass struggles, to represent them as part of the moderate responses to colonial penetration and later to apartheid. But we are going to be focusing on historical moments when quite evidently, one, it is black radical thought that is at work, in mobilizing the masses, and two, that the character of such a response is actually mass-based. We are going to be picking up, different historical moments when the black radical tradition was actually defining, forms of resistance and forms of engagement, with a white supremacist social and political structure. It is a difficult thing to do, particularly today, where the black radical tradition is not only marginalized, but when one begins to even refer to it, it is actually being seen as a kind of an insanity. The interesting thing is that, just in terms of American thought, the black radical tradition is often characterized and seen as a kind of deviant behavior, which explains why it would be a body like the Federal, Council of psychiatrists, who would support research on the black radical tradition in South Africa, because it is a mental condition, in terms of American perceptions. But it does not actually mean that in the South African context, the black radical tradition is given the recognition that it deserves. And it is our assertion that the last moment of expression on the political terrain of a black radical movement was in fact the 1970s mass movement, and that Black Wednesday would have then signaled, the end of the black radical tradition for the 20th century. And I think it has to be made clear today and now that as we speak, there was never any kind of articulation of black radical thought in political activism since the 1970s. And the reason for that has been that the black radical tradition as a radical paradigm and as a radical mode of thought was actually displaced. It had been displaced throughout, as a radical form of engagement. But the 1980s and early 1990s actually represented the final assault on what was actually left of the black radical tradition of the 20th century, and particularly, of the movement of the 1970s. And it is our assertion that in actual fact, in the 1980s and 1990s, the determination to actually systematically assault and destroy the black radical tradition as an instrument of mass mobilization, but as well as a subject of intellectual and academic discourse, was not only undertaken by the white supremacist state of P.W. Botha, but it is also true, that in attempting to displace the black radical tradition, the mass democratic movement of the 1980s was actually grounded also on an agenda of actually destroying the black radical tradition. And that makes it is that which makes it even more extremely difficult, first to reflect on what the black radical tradition, particularly in 20th century South Africa, stood for.
Sorry
Yes.
to disturb you.
Yes.
Because I guess we're going to have section by section. So let's
Yes.
go back to 1912 and how was ANC formed? Because you was talking about how it relates to Bambata and why ANC had
Yes.
to be formed
Yes.
after the Bambata rebellion.
Yes. Just in terms of it being a mass movement from the very onset, I think it has to be established, that for the ANC to actually become a mass movement at its formation, it has to already appeal to the masses. But I do understand, that how does one begin to understand how the masses were constituted in 1912? It is for that reason that I gave this explanation, that in 1910 you have a new geographic impression being created, the creation of a colonial state, the South African state. So in this case, for the ANC to be able to be a mass movement, it would have to appeal to masses across South Africa. And when it is formed in 1912, one would hope that the ANC is going to become that. Now, today there are reflections on that ANC of 1912, and it is said that historians and political activists actually want to make the claim that at that point in 1912, the ANC was in fact a mass-based movement. But evidence does point to the contrary. Evidence does point to the fact that the ANC was constituted as, we can use the term middle class. But if we were to go back to the context of the time, the term that is more appropriate to use to be able to define this, small section of black society that the ANC represents, we use the term amanzimtiti, and I need to explain what that means. In the context of 1912, in the context of early 20th South Africa, the native population, was actually divided into two. Today we can talk quite probably less confidently, but we can make reference, to the fact that there's the black middle class and there's the black, underclass or working class, whatever terminology that we may choose. But in the context of the time, you would have had a social class, and the term gets to be a bit derogative, in a sense, when it is used, because you have a kind of a cohort of black society that aspires to being exempted from the application of native law. Now, what that actually meant is that they wanted to be treated as other than native category of black people. No doubt you would have heard, quite a good number of lawyers, professionals, in that group of black people. But just in terms of the character of the leadership, that would have been the character of the Sank leadership when it was established in 1912. Now, what you are actually missing out here is a kind of leadership that is rooted within what would be the masses. But the masses in this particular context are Africans that are trapped in what we refer to as the native sphere. So Amanzimtiti are that group that manages to free themselves, who are able to take flight from the native sphere and become something other than the natives. And during this period, yeah.
But this was a category, you would say, that the British administration allowed itself, isn't it?
Yes.
This was the first.
Actually encouraged, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Actually encouraged.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
But also the Indian element comes into it, which is what I'm just about to come to. Because what the Indians are struggling for at this time, led by Mahatma Gandhi, is the refusal to descend into the native sphere. And Gandhi himself made that pretty clear, that Indians should not be treated like the dirty kafir or the dirty kafir. And that in fact symbolizes this kind of, class stratification that begins to actually emerge. But what we are interested in here is the native sphere. You know, what we are interested in is the native sphere, because the masses, as time goes on, deeper into the 20th century, it is the masses, who are going to be defining what black radical thought is, what black radical political activism is. So in 1912, when the ANC is established, it is established by that kind of a leadership, which does not reflect.
Because don't they say it was established by the kings and the queens?
Well, those will come into the picture. But, people like Pixley Gaseme do not actually come from the royal family. Solplaki did not actually come from the royal family. Nor did actually Dube come from the royal family. In fact, the interesting thing about Dube we might as well deal with, because Dube actually becomes, the first president of the ANC. And he becomes quite an enigma in very many ways. And this is where those that are sympathetic, historians that are sympathetic to the ANC, found themselves having to explain Dube away. And the kinds of terms that you come across are terms like the ambiguities of dependence. So what is it that defines Dube, as a person, as a political subject? It is an ambiguity. It is an ambiguity of dependence. Here is an attempt to try, and explain a kind of a schizophrenia, if one may actually use the term. And this is what actually characterizes that kind of a leadership. It is completely detached, from what the masses are. But and ANC apologies over the years would love to, conceal and actually mask, this particular relationship of first the ANC leadership in 1912 and the masses, and much later of the ANC as a formation, as an organization, and its relationship to the masses. But within a year of the ANC's formation, and this is where yet again, it can be tested for, for the presence or absence of a black radical tradition and black radical thought. Within a year of its formation, you have the 1913 Land Act. Now, this is important. This is a kind of legislation that would have inspired, would have provoked the ANC into some kind of an action, even though it may not have made the ANC to actually start mobilizing the masses in the way that we have characterized them. There would have been, a particular class of African society at this time, that would have looked at the 1913 Land Act and felt that it was threatened by it. Now, the one thing that we need to explain, before we even, because this is the one issue that we need to deal with, what we are testing here is whether the ANC, structured as it was in 1912, would have been able to respond, to issues that would have been affecting, a larger part of black society. But in this case, we are even looking at what at the time is a category of society that was referred to as independent African producers. And we are talking here about, that cohort of black society that was involved in the production of food, in food production. And food production is a commercial, kind of undertaking. They were at the center, of that process. Not only were they at the center of it, but they were in control of those production processes. And what it therefore meant is that just in terms of revenue, at the end of each, cycle, at the end of each year, it is them who benefit from these processes. And that is what we have to understand, that the Land Act of 1913 is an attack on that particular kind of what the Afrikaner would see as privileged status of independent African producers. That is what the Land Act is about. It is not about taking land away from African people. By then, land belonging to African people is the 13% land that is well provided for in the 1913 Land Act. Already that's the land that Africans already have. The issue here is that if there's tracts of vacant land, it is vacant crown land. It is not land that was available to African people. So what we need to understand is that the Land Act of 1913 was not an instrument of land dispossession. Land dispossession had already taken place and probably even consolidated in the 1884 Congress in Berlin. It was merely to consolidate the actual dispossession of land. What we are dealing with in the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century is, in fact, both colonial penetration and colonial imposition. And this is where we are at this stage. The independent African producers are faced with a set of colonial impositions that they have to deal with in 1913. And that is an attack on the fact that just in terms of the production processes on what is actually commercial white farms, they are in control of the processes, and therefore they determine the distribution of the social goods at the end of every cycle and at the end of every year. And this is what the Land Act of 1913 is designed to do, to undermine this particular cohort, of black society. No one can say the ANC that sunk at the time, the South African Native National Congress. No one can say they did not understand this. They did. In actual fact, Sol Plaatje comes out of a family of independent, black producers. His parents were actually sharecroppers, across the Orange Free State before Sol Plaatje actually moved to Kimberley. But they were actually sharecroppers themselves, and he comes out of that experience. But the ANC never actually had an agenda or a kind of a program that was going to intervene on this issue. The least that they did was to actually constitute a delegation which was sent to London to go and appeal, to the monarch, to the British king and the British government to intervene on their behalf. But while this was happening, the First World War breaks out. But be that as it may, they were turned down and told to return and sort it out with the Boers back in South Africa. And for all intents and purposes, the delegation was a failure. But I think people need to get a sense here that there wasn't any kind of concerted effort, on the part of the ANC to deal with the particular aspects of the 1913 Land Act and be able to mobilize the very cohort of black society, that was to be affected by it. So when the war goes on, we can say, well, the ANC would not have much to do, because the world is at war. And the war comes to an end in 1918. But black people participated in this war, and black people participated on the side of the British, and therefore they were actually backing the victorious power. And at the end of the war, the ANC, this time the president being Sefako Makgatho, decided that they were going to use black participation in the war and their contribution, to persuade the British government to intervene, on behalf of black people. And Makgatho actually penned a letter to the British monarch. The letter actually is cited in quite a number of sources, but the language of that letter, and apologists will actually say, but that was the language of the time. Just in terms of the language, of the letter, the ANC actually concedes and actually gives sovereignty, recognizes the sovereignty of the British monarch, over South Africa. And they actually make a plea that, we are subjects of the British king and we have participated in this war and, we deserve some kind of, but it is that sort of communication, one that is actually begging, for some kind of monarchical intervention. But once again, it comes to nothing. But here's an interesting thing, that in South African historiography, it is often argued that the ANC became radicalized in 1917 when Sefako Makhatu became the president. And well, the reason for that, it is argued, is that they were beginning to respond, to issues that were affecting the masses. And in this case, the particular case that is being mentioned is the fact that Sefako Makhatu wrote a letter supporting the strike of, sanitary workers. That's how they were actually characterized as sanitary workers in Johannesburg. Now, these are workers who were employed at the time. Johannesburg was on a bucket system, so their job was to remove, sewage from Johannesburg and actually dump it at a sewage farm. And the sewage farm was actually situated just behind UJ, just behind UJ's Soweto campus, actually. That's where the sewage farm actually was situated. So these guys, near?
Near the blacks.
Yeah, it was actually here in Pimville. I mean, just behind, it was a sewage farm. It had to be, at the time when Pimville was actually emerging. So the ANC actually supported that strike. And even then, it was just to write a letter of support. And already, some historians apologetic to the ANC are beginning to see, some kind of movement towards, embracing the people. And no doubt, the minor strike of 1920 again, the ANC did actually express, support of that strike. But here comes the issue now. In 1919 as well, and this is important, we need to spend a little time on this, because the point that I need to make is that, in the first 7 years of the ANC's existence, it may have been doing, all of that and actually responding only to issues that would have affected Amanzimtiti or the exempted. But it doesn't mean the black radical tradition and black radical thought was completely non-existent. I've pointed out that if Bambata Rebellion was a filter, one of the traditions that it would have allowed to pass through would be black radical thought and black radical, kind of political activism. And in 1919, a community emerges with particular kinds of demands. And it actually makes such an impact, that everybody has to sit and take notice. And a great deal is actually being written and said about this particular community, including the fact that it is a religious sect. Now, once people use those kinds of labels, you do know that the purpose and the intention is to undermine the character of this particular movement, because this was a movement, and this particular sect that is being seen as only a sect, it referred to itself as Ama Israeli, and and they were being said to be a religious sect, that was actually inspired by some kind of millenarian, kind of thought processes. Ama Israeli were actually based in Queenstown, just outside Queenstown. And by 1919, 1920, there are developments not only in South Africa but globally. This is the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And part of what you get is a global kind of recession, which also affects South Africa to a certain extent. But Added to that for South Africa, and was the Spanish influenza of 1918. So you can begin to see that there's a great deal of things that people need to respond to, to deal with. And in 1919, Ama-Israeli emerge, and they start, you know, encroaching into what is, well, vacant land. But this is something that people had been doing over time, over centuries of time, moving into land that is available because that land was available anyway. But at this stage, the land had been designated as vacant crown land. Now, that was problematic. It was problematic precisely because this community was growing. And as it was growing, there was a demand for more land, to be used specifically for things that were absolutely critical. Land was actually used to establish new homesteads as new families were emerging. That's a natural growth of this particular community, and that is why they move into what is now designated in 1919 as vacant crown land. Now, this is a kind of phenomenon that they cannot relate to. There is no white settlement, where they are. They are not pushing, an existing white settlement off that land because there isn't any white settlement at all. At the very least, there should have been a kind of colonial infrastructure, in the form of roads and railway networks. But if you think about the railway, it only went as far as Gravreinet. It didn't go past at this stage into Queenstown and into King Williamstown. But this was vacant crown land. So these people, this community kept moving into crown land. And from time to time, the magistrate in King Williamstown, having been informed, by either the local captain, he would come and remonstrate with them, telling them to stop and actually to move back. But Gijima, as the leader, always found a way to explain himself away. And in 1920, he promised that, look, we are going to move away from here, but because he's also a healer, people are coming in, because they are ill. But once this is done, after Passover of 1920, we'll move. But he knew, and it was clear that he wasn't intending to move, precisely because after the magistrate had left, the settlement was expanded, and that became pretty clear that this is not going to be happening. Now, that issue became a matter that was discussed in the National Assembly in 1921. It became a matter of parliamentary discussions. And at the time, Smuts was actually the prime minister, and he was actually being criticized very heavily for being unable to deal with it. So, in a sense, Mgijima was also becoming an irritation to the national government. And this is when they started making serious threats, about moving into Bulhoek. But before we see how the government responds, it was quite clear that unless they complied, something very serious was going to happen. But at the same time, there were meetings taking place in other parts of South Africa. Like in 1920, there was a meeting that was held in Durban, and there is a delegate who came to this meeting in Durban and started talking about Marcus Garvey and the Garvey movement. And the man was given an opportunity to speak, and he spoke, about, and what he was telling the audience is that the Americans are coming, and the Americans are going to be coming with their aircraft, with their aeroplanes, and they will be dropping bombs, charcoal bombs, on white society. Now, these kinds of things being said in the 1910s, in the 1920s, would certainly have made quite an impression. And Mgijima's nephew, his name was Gideon, was actually working in Durban at the time. And when he came home, he was able to bring all of this excitement, back to Mgijima about the Americans coming to rescue Africans from this colonial yoke that, that they were subjected to. It is at this stage, when the stage was set, for something to happen, that Sefako Makgato again wrote a letter to Enoch Mgijima, and this time he was pleading with Enoch Mgijima to please comply with what you are being told by the prime minister, and just retreat, because if you don't, there's going to be bloodshed. Now, Enoch Mgijima did not even dignify Makgatu with a reply. He never responded to Makgatu's letter. And they waited to see what the government was going to do. And I think it was on the 21st of May, 1921, Smuts actually ordered, at the time they would call it the South African Military Police, but it would be what would become the South African Defence Force. It was actually an army that was sent into Bulhoek, outside Queenstown. And the number of casualties there was nearly 200, of Ama Israeli who died. Now, the story of Ama Israeli did not end there. Just in terms of representation in South African historiography, you have that entire movement is not accounted for. If it is accounted for, it is only one line that says in 1921 there was the Bulhoek massacre. But you don't really get, any kind of text in South Africa that actually explains what the Bulhoek, massacre was about. But that was only the beginning. The Ama Israeli and the Bulhoek massacre actually marked only the beginning of what would become, a very vibrant mass movement, that would last between 1919 and 1939. In that 20-year period, there was a black mass movement. Quite clearly, what I've just pointed out here is that this is a mass movement that was inspired by the Marcus Garvey tradition. And we will see that subsequent formations, that followed the Bulhoek and the Ama Israeli, were also actually inspired by the Marcus Garvey, black radical thought. The one movement that emerges in 1922-23 was actually dominated by women. And this is a movement that they refer to themselves as Amafela Ndawonye, which means we all die at the same place and we all die at the same time. Now, this is what people were prepared to do, the sacrifice that people were prepared to make, so that they can be able to deal with this colonial imposition. Now, between 1922 and 1925, Amafela Ndawonye were actually involved in a number of programs. And these programs are very interesting to look at. They were, using the same, getting into the same kinds of contestations over land, because they would, today we call these, land grab. This was a typical land grab. But they would go into vacant land, erect a school, build a church, and do that sort of thing. And that in itself was the form that resistance actually took. It was resistance to a colonial imposition. So in 1924 and early 1925, Amafela Ndawonye were rounded up. The leadership was rounded up, and in 1926, they were in court, which ended in 1927. Now, there were 27 people on trial, and all of them were convicted. Now, of the 27, 24 of them were women. And we are here talking about women, younger women in their late teens, into their 20s and 30s, probably into the mid-40s. This is the age group that we are talking about, that got involved in that movement. And that was the second movement of Amafela Ndawonye. Now, the major movement of the period was called the Wellingtonian movement. Now, the Wellingtonian movement was established by a man called Wellington Buthelezi. And Wellington Buthelezi actually, he went into Transkei and, posed as an African American. And he said, he gave himself a name, Wellington, Hansard or something. And, he went along with that name. And he said he had a medical practice in Chicago, but he had decided to come to South Africa to fight against, colonial penetration. And there were a lot of stories. And at some point, he gets arrested, and it does get to be embarrassing. But just as the leader of the Wellingtonian movement, I think that's the one thing that we need to take away about Wellington Buthelezi, because the Wellingtonian movement lasted much longer. It was more enduring, than the rest of them. Starting from 1923, up to 1939, it took about 16 years, for the movement to actually finally be dealt with, by the authorities. So,
What was it? How did they move? What's so special about it?
what did
What is so special about it?
again, it is, we are talking about the same issue here. What they are doing is to actually be going into what is vacant land and doing what Ama Israeli were doing with the land. And that was becoming quite a major issue. But on the side, there would be other issues that would come on the side. Remember, these people have access to land, they grow crops. And at this time, you are beginning to have commercial penetration, also of the rural hinterland. So they exchange the stuff, their produce with the Indian shopkeepers or the Jewish shopkeepers. It becomes a kind of an exchange, kind of commercial relationship, with people of other races. And from time to time, there would be tensions and conflicts over pricing. And, Amafela Ndawonye, the Wellingtonian movement gets to be involved, on the part of the people in those kinds of things. But basically, they were doing what Ama Israeli would have been doing, using vacant land to, in fact, for them, because they were becoming a bigger movement, the demand for land was even much more, intense than it would have been for smaller kinds of movements. Yeah, yeah,
Just in terms of addressing Sister Nziki's
yeah,
question here of what it is. These movements were particularly strong in the arenas of religion and education
yes,
in response to colonial imposition. They were
yeah,
particularly directed at the colonial ideology, if
yeah,
you will, in those two
yes,
spheres.
yes, yeah,
In the religious sphere, Ethiopianism
yeah,
would have been the currency, but they were very, very strong in terms of wanting to sidestep
yeah, the European
yes,
education.
yes, European education, and also connect with the international broader black mass movement,
Yeah,
the Gavia
yeah.
movement, as a means of the colleges like Tuskegee, people, African Americans, or all the diaspora,
Yes, yes.
as a means of uplifting from within the African masses. You see,
Yeah,
Walter Sisulu's, I think, grandmother or something was
Yeah, yeah.
pretty strong
Yes,
Amafela.
right, yeah, in terms of establishing,
Yes, Amafela.
yeah,
Amafela.
Amafela Ndawonye, yeah.
And hence the importance of women. Do you see?
Yes.
And hence the importance of women
Yeah.
in this regard.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, true. I think also this is what, one American historian refers to as it was the politics of religion, where religion and politics were fused, into one. Yeah, but I think,
But in a sense, the core issue was the African self-image.
yes,
This was the
yeah,
politics of the African
yes,
self-image.
yeah,
Yes, and the fact that the colonial state, the British colonial state was beginning to, in a sense, adjust and bend towards the will of the Afrikaners, and make less available the liberal arts and so on and so
yeah,
forth to
yeah.
the African masses
Yeah.
go towards a more vocationally centered
Yes.
training.
Yeah.
You remember? So this was an attempt to rescue
Yeah.
the African masses. Edgar Tayele, the ANC leader,
Yeah.
is particularly instructive in this. I'm
Yes.
sure
Yeah.
you could elaborate.
Yeah. In fact, again, the 1920s here. I mean, we've been talking about what actually happens in the interior of the country, and that is introducing Taele, what we haven't touched upon, and it also becomes quite important just in terms of transmitting, black radical thought. It is what actually happens in the Western Cape and in Cape Town in particular. And Taele becomes important in that respect. But yes, I mean, what we are looking at here, Ama Israeli themselves. And first, I needed to deal with the fact that they may well be a religious, kind of community. But that is not what defines them, when one considers their engagement with the colonial state. Because with the colonial state, what defines them are the kinds of antagonisms that are being generated, by the presence of the colonial state. And these antagonisms are related to land. And also the issue of education is also related to land, because for them, it is not actually sending children to colonial, to institutions created by the colonial state. They want to establish their own schools. And to do so, they actually needed land. So, which is why, even if their struggles were about other things, but because land was important for them to be able to do those things, their struggles ultimately became the struggle about land. But yes, I think it is useful here for the viewers to understand that at this stage, politics and religion are so intertwined, that they actually become inseparable. In fact, it is true that religion provides an ideological buttress, for the kind of political activism, that happens at this time. Would you agree? Yeah. So at some point, I think it was quite useful, because at some point we are going to have to talk about, the ICU. But at this stage, we've referred to other movements that were operating outside of the ANC. Since we started talking about Ama Israeli, we're actually talking about what was happening in South Africa historically. But the only time when we mention the ANC, it is when Sufako Makhathi wrote that letter. So we begin to see that a black radical, kind of initiative is at work here. But that black radical initiative is constructed in such a way that it is impermeable to the ANC. The ANC cannot relate to this. So you can see that the only thing that they can do, is to side with the colonial state and actually ask, Gijima to comply. But that shows the relationship, that the ANC historically would have with the masses, because quite clearly what Ama Israeli are, they are a cohort of the masses, something that the ANC is unable to relate to. But also during this time, in 1922, we are going to talk about the emergence of another form of radicalism that is going to impact heavily on the black radical tradition. And that is the creation of the South African Communist Party and the emergence of the red radicalism of the Roy Gevaar, which begins to contest for space with the Swart Gevaar, the black radical tradition being the Swart Gevaar. So yes, around 1924, then you have Ama Fellendown, but the Wellingtonian movement is also quite clearly a religious movement, actually. Wellington actually does use, religious kinds of symbols, whenever he has his mass meetings. By 1927, the colonial state is becoming quite uncomfortable, with what the Wellingtonian movement was doing. One of the things that the Wellingtonian movement did in 27 was to organize a boycott, a tax boycott, that people should stop because at the time you would use your crops, bags of maize, to pay taxes to the local headman. And they were organizing a kind of boycott, a tax boycott. And quite clearly, Buthelezi was becoming a nuisance. And in 1927, the government passed the Native Administration Act of 1927. And later it was called the Black Administration Act. But the provisions of the act were actually directed at Buthelezi himself, because they were actually, adopted so as to deal with him. The issue here is that during this period, if you were arrested for any transgression, you go through the court system. The British colonial administration wanted to be seen to be, working according to the law. So you go through the court system. And often than not, people would get away with what they do, out of the court system. So Herzog was becoming quite aware that, the courts are not quite, friendly to the government. So he decided the Native Administration Act. And what that act did was to give the Governor General was the representative of the British monarch in South Africa. He would become what would be the state president, after some time. So the Governor General could pass laws by proclamation. And in 1929, by proclamation, the Governor General decided to ban Wellington Buthelezi from entering Transkei completely. So from that year, he was barred from entering the Transkei. This obviously was going to undermine, the Wellingtonian movement itself. But it persisted into the 1930s. And the ways in which Buthelezi was able to mobilize people beyond 1929 was to be situated on the border, with Transkei, and this would be in Graaff-Reinet. And on Sundays, the people would cross over into Graaff-Reinet and have meetings there, and then they would go back in the afternoon. So, but the movement was beginning to, suffer some setbacks during the 1930s. But, they persevered, and by this time there were other things that were, beginning to, to hit on these communities. Among these was the drought of 1932 and 1933, and this was driving a lot of families out of the rural hinterland and onto the urban areas. But still, this movement was able to persist. In 1936,
To be sure, I think it needs to be clarified that the tax, Wellington Buthelezi encouraging the masses not to pay the taxes was related to him not recognizing the authority and the sovereignty of the Queen.
Yes.
And this was related really to his Gaviite affiliation.
Yes,
The fact that they had refused any colonial sovereignty. So I think that ought to be. And another thing is that the mention of prophetess non-debtor ought to be
and the issue about about not recognizing the authority of the British monarch, no doubt has to do, and as Ndatemolora says, it has to do with Gaviite influences in Wellington Buthelezi. But the other thing about his Gaviite connections is that Buthelezi represented the Wellington movement as the South African chapter of the Gaviite movement. And what was the Gaviite movement? It was the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. Now, that was Marcus Garvey's movement in the US. So in South Africa, Wellington would have seen the Wellingtonian movement as a chapter, of UNIA in South Africa. And thanks to Ndatemolora, this is another very important movement, that I almost overlooked. In 1923, Prophetess non-debtor, also coming out of a religious background, also organizes, her congregation. They are doing the same things. It is all about land. It is all about, the expansion of the community, natural growth. It is all about creating schools and churches. And they also are involved in the same kinds of political activities, because these activities are definitely political. And Prophet,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
But organized under the auspices of refusal of the sovereignty of the colonial
yes,
state.
yes,
All
yeah, all the
organized
time,
such
yes,
things.
yeah,
And this in contrast to the ANC on the other
when
hand, which is
yes,
organized around the recognition
yeah,
of the sovereignty of the colonial state.
yeah, and expect,
I think this
yes,
contrast
yeah,
ought to be made, because you are making the point that you are attempting to exclude the ANC from the black radical
yes,
tradition.
yes, yeah, yeah,
Yes, I'm sorry.
and that's the basis of exclusion anyway. The basis of exclusion is that the ANC embraces the colonial order, and the black radical tradition does not actually, recognize, the colonial order, but the ENC does. Yes, no doubt that is true, and that's that's quite helpful.
This is quite relevant because people like Advocate Tembeka Toby are dedicated to the contrary position and attempting
Yes.
to make the case that in fact the ANC has from the very beginning been dedicated to the proposition of African sovereignty, isn't it?
Yes, but which he would try to defend in terms of, his reading of the Freedom Charter. But I think, in fact, this is going to be important. Can we come back to that? When we get to discussing the Freedom Charter, because, I really want the viewers to be able to understand, the nature of struggles that went on in South Africa between, particularly, not not exclusive to that period, but particularly during that period, in the 20 years between 19 and 39. And in historical terms, we often talk about the 20 years between the two wars, the First World War and the Second World War. And this is what we are trying to do here. We are constructing a historical kind of a narrative, that accounts for that period. And at the same time, we are actually pointing out to important, political activities, that were undertaken by these communities to confront. And this, at this stage, we said it is not actually at the point of conquest, but this is colonialism wanting to impose itself. This is at the point at which what the people are confronted with is colonial imposition. Now, going into the 1930s, you still have these kinds of land struggles going on. But the point I was actually making before we went, to the other issues that Ntatemolora raised was the fact that there was an impact of the 1932, drought, which actually hit particularly the eastern part of the country. And this was actually followed by floods. Now, as a result of that, a lot of black families this time, had to leave their rural hinterland. But then in 1936, Herzog passes an act of parliament. It is the Native Laws and Trust Act of 1936. Now, the act itself is particularly pernicious, to these rural communities, particularly those across the Transkei and in parts of Zululand. Because what it does, is to begin to limit the land that is available, to these families in the Transkei. But at the same time, you are beginning to see the expansion of public infrastructure, such as roads and railways, into that territory. So what used to be vacant crown land is now actually being used up. And this actually puts a great deal of pressure, on African communities in those regions. We shall come back to the other part. During the same period, the Orange Free State, here we are talking about, a province that is kind of commercial agriculture, and the Afrikaner are in control. But in that province, it is black independent producers, who are in control of the production processes. And the 1930s become absolutely critical because they put pressure on them as well. But just in terms of, the native reserves, because what we are talking about, the Transkei, Zululand, these are native reserves, and all these developments are taking place there. So in the 1930s, 1936, Herzog introduces the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936. And what it does is to actually limit the land available to African families in those rural areas. And this inspires an organization called the All Africa Convention. It becomes the All Africa Convention that confronts this issue. And the All Africa Convention is actually made up of a number of other smaller formations. One of these is the Non-European Unity Movement. There are ANC members, people who associate themselves with the ANC, who actually attend the AAC conference. One of these is, in fact, what's his name? Ashbim Da's father was a captain. He attended the meeting as well. And Ashbim Da actually went, he was 20 at the time. He was 20 years old, and he did actually accompany, his father to the meeting. So the AAC would have had quite a number of political formations represented in it. And they were trying to confront this new measure by Herzog. But the long and the short of it is that it collapsed. It didn't actually have quite an impact. And 2-3 years later, the Second World War starts. And when the Second World War starts, these are new developments. And it is in that year that the Wellingtonian movement is finally dealt with. The leadership of the Wellingtonian movement is taken into prison. But there's one leader I need to speak about of the Wellingtonian movement. And this was Edward Zibi. Edward Zibi was actually a chief. And his brother, Charles Zibi, was also a chief. But Edward Zibi joined the Wellingtonian movement because, for the simple reason that he understood that, there was more power to be derived from the masses than there was from the colonial state. And therefore he sided with the masses. And his mother too, was actually involved with the Wellingtonian movement. And amongst other things that they did was to actually establish quite a number of schools in their own area. The reality here is that although the Wellingtonian movement, almost died with the leadership when it went to jail, Edward Zibi was convicted in 1939, and he was sent to 4 years in prison. And so were the other three, who were arrested with him. But Zibi continued to run the school, quite a number of schools, into 1940 and into 1941. It lasted until then. And the major reason why it was impossible after 1941, to continue with this was precisely because the government passed an act. And that act was known as the War Measures Act. Now, there's a provision in the War Measures Act that said, that lifted all restrictions on labor movement. Now, what was happening here? This was the government actually mobilizing or recruiting labor from the rural areas into the urban areas, particularly the urban areas of the PWV region. What's the PWV? By the way, it is Gauteng today. What is the province of Gauteng today was in fact the PWV. This is where in the 1930s, and now leading to the war, the process actually accelerated. This is when South Africa went through a manufacturing revolution, when factories were cropping up along the railway line, from Springs to Carletonville, and there were all these factories cropping up, job opportunities becoming available. Now, at the same time, by 1941, South Africa is fully drawn into the war situation. At this stage, the war is actually being fought around Tobruk in North Africa. So more troops are being taken out of the country. In actual fact, white labor is being drained, and being, directed to the war effort. So there are spaces that are being created for black people to come into the urban areas. Let me make this important remark. At this stage, the migration of labor into the urban areas is not characterized by single male migration. At this stage, what you are seeing is actually family migration. People are moving with entire families to the urban areas, and that's going to be absolutely critical when we look at the Mpanza movement, because what we are dealing with is not single males that are coming to work on the mines and live in the hostels. What we are looking at are families that are already being provided with 2-roomed houses and 3-roomed houses in Orlando, where they could live as families. Why is that so? That is so because manufacturing industry does not work well with migrant single male labor. What it requires for optimum output from a laborer is a laborer that lives in family circumstances. But there are other costs to that. It would mean the cost of reproduction of that labor should fall on the employer, should actually fall on the manufacturing class. But they find a way of offsetting that. They pay low wages and still expect the urban-based family to bear the cost of its own reproduction. And that is how you become a perpetual underclass. I think we can take a little break here.
All right. Oh, so this is the end of the
Yeah,
section.
no, this will be the, but not today.
No, I'm saying this
Yeah.
is the end of an episode.
Yeah, let's, yeah.